and have a closed session. Now we'll move on to policy review, and then we'll come back to the closed session on transportation cameras.
Good morning. We have 5 policy items today to workshop. The first of which is a review to revise policy 2.70, prohibiting discrimination, including sexual and other forms of harassment. This was reviewed by Policy and Forms Committee in January. There are no citation changes. The only proposed language is to be inserted in section 1A. There was some questions raised about what is genetic information with regards to discrimination, and that is basically as when people are tested for a disease or to see if they are predisposed to a particular disease, they have their genetic material analyzed, that can't be used to discriminate against that individual. I'll be glad to answer any other questions you may have.
And and I'm really asking this, Mr. Bradshaw, for clarification. This is that we cannot discriminate on that individual. I know sometimes people will think that that means if I believe this, then that other person can't do this. This has to do with the school district may not do anything to the individual's freedom or rights in this capacity. Thank you.
Okay, Chuck, and on this, we're just reviewing, we're not
Correct.
making any act, just reviewing.
If you have any questions or
What is the statement that we have on our employment applications? Is it what's in numbers? It's not in C, because C is for students. Do we put A on that application, or what is required on that? Do you know?
I'm not really familiar with the employment application.
Yeah, we're an equal opportunity employer, is what our application says. The quote 2.70, is that the question? If we have 2.70 letter A on there, is that?
Right, 2.70. I just didn't know if.
No, it's not referenced. This policy is not referenced on our application. It says we're equal opportunity employer.
Right. I mean, it says, does it give this we don't discriminate clause in there? Do you know, or do we have? Okay.
I can't answer off the top of my head. I can find out and bring that information to you.
No, that's okay. I was just curious because I didn't know if, I understand from when I talked to Mr. Dixon that, the difference between A and C. C deals with students, but yet A deals with students and employees in reality, because A deals with under any education program, whereas C deals with just admitting students. So I didn't know how we dealt with that in the HR sense. I mean, this is our only policy on discrimination, though, isn't it?
In policy chapter 6, I believe there's also a policy regarding harassment and discrimination as well.
Okay.
Chapter 6, but I'll pull that up right as we speak.
The genetic information, when would that be actually available? I mean, how would people know a person's genetic information?
A lot of people have testing done, as part of their medical procedures. A lot of people just do it to see, if they may have a predisposition.
And although we can't ask them, people disclose things to us too. Although you can't ask someone, certain questions during an interview, people disclose things, which is fine, as long as it was voluntary on their part. And if they say, I'm predisposed to a certain type of disease or something because of genetic things, so we can't discriminate.
I mean, this is one of those statements that, you're reading it, everybody's going to say, what the heck is that? When they read it. I mean, that's the way I see genetic information, but this is obviously coming down from the federal government or the state government, or where did that wording come from?
It came from our consultant, which takes information from the Florida legislature. When they adopt new statutes, then they translate that into policy. So if we have things in our policy that aren't up to date, then they recommend making those changes.
They probably put genetic predispositions or something, to be clear. I agree
It's
with
just a
Ken.
broad term to encompass any kind of genetic information that may be disclosed, that you won't discriminate against somebody because you know something about their genetic makeup.
Mr. Goddard, have any more questions? Okay. Any more questions?
I have one, and I'll ask in a second. We can move on, and I can come back to it. It's not going to
No,
hold
no,
us up.
yeah.
I do know I'm looking up the,
Oh.
I had one here, and I just, so if we could,
Put that in our pocket and we'll take it
yeah,
out.
we would. It'll only take a second afterwards. Thank you.
Is our website down right now? Is that-
The internet connection, our network connection.
Everything's good now, so
Oh, it
should
is?
be.
Okay. I was trying to get on our policy manual and I can't get on.
I've still been having trouble, Doc.
You can't get on it?
Yeah, I was having trouble with,
Okay.
So we'll move on to number 2.
Yes, please.
Okay, this is another one which, policy 3.48, service animals, this is a new policy, and we do have some guidelines that are in process, and with it, we've had some issues relating to parents bringing service animals into schools. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to balance the need to allow service animals to come into the schools with the health, safety, and welfare of the students to make sure that we can properly identify those animals and make sure they're service animals and see how we can accommodate them. But that's going to be in the guidelines.
One question I had is that on number 3, it says a service animal is any dog. And then it goes on to say, other species of animals are not considered to be service animals. There are, what's that?
Sorry. I mean,
Oh, no.
sometimes miniature horses can be a service animal.
Well, I know, and there's monkeys, there's a lot of different service animals, but we only have to deal with dogs as service animals? That's the statute, I take it? Is that?
I haven't had an opportunity to do this, so
It says in here that they are dogs, but they do allow miniature horses may be used as an alternative to dogs with certain limitations. However, they are not included in the definition of service animal. So, I mean, we would allow a horse if it were documented that it was in fact, a needed service animal.
this, I'm pretty sure, was part of statute that was passed last legislative
Yeah,
session.
that's where this came from.
And I think that language is directly from that. There has been, though, this last legislative session, I don't know that it's, how far it's gotten, but there was some modifications, Mr. Dodd, trying to, for that very reason, I think, is people were like, wait a minute, so they have a small horse? But I think right now this is part of that. Could the board act as one body and have a service animal here?
Yes. I would suggest an elephant. We used to do it.
You're limited.
Okay, that was touche. That was really good, Madam Chair. That was really good.
I think the issue that we need to deal with in the guidelines is how do we identify that it is in fact a service animal and is it licensed, does it have a certificate, do we need to document that, and then in advance we'll know how to balance it with the needs. Some students are allergic to dogs, and staff can have a service animal, so we need to deal with that in the guidelines as well. So if a staff member has a service animal.
And do we need to put within what we're doing here, dealing with it, or is that
That's going to come in the
something else?
guidelines.
In the okay. And I know this is a problem out in the public too, because of the comfort animals, many people take an animal with them because they're depressed or sad or whatever, they're experiencing.
I mean, Pam, did you want to come and address some of these? I mean, that she might give you a better understanding of how they're used.
Okay.
Last year, the Department of Education did set out new guidelines for use of service animals in schools, and I've been looking at them. We already have in our animals on school property policy a section on service animals that relates to students, that it has to have a task assigned to that dog or animal for it to be considered a service animal, and it has to be integrated in the student's IEP and 504 plan. That's all been written out in the past. I think 2009 or something, it was written up. We have not, to my knowledge, implemented it because we haven't had a service animal direct request. We've had a couple families that have been looking into or have purchased a service animal or in the process of training and seeing whether or not they're going to bring that service animal to the school. But with these new guidelines that came out last, I think it was over the summer, that they were actually official from the Department of Education, we've been looking at our guidelines and we're just going to align what we already have in that animals on school property. We're going to lift that out and put those guidelines with a little bit of tweaking if we need to into this new policy that they're for service animals. Since they were kind of hidden in that animal on school property, they were difficult to find for the schools. So if we pull it out and put it separately. And regarding the miniature horses versus dogs versus monkeys, actually the ADA says that a service animal is defined as a dog, but it has a little disclaimer about miniature horses. They don't necessarily recognize in their definition pigs and monkeys and elephants and anything else regarding that. Yeah, but it's actually that they're defined as a dog, and then they do have the disclaimer about the miniature horses. So.
Would in guidelines, this also be like, is there insurance liabilities that the owners have to have? I'm thinking again, like if we're having to permit those, and I, by the way, I don't want that to be that I'm not supportive of it, because I think we've had some great circumstances, but I didn't
Yeah,
know.
one of them was like a diabetic dog,
Yeah, I
severe
heard that. That was that.
diabetic,
Yeah.
that the dog would be trained to sniff if their blood sugar goes extremely low, and then that way it would trigger, the student's not really paying attention to their own symptoms. The dog will notice it ahead of time and trigger them to go seek the assistance they need to get their sugar back up. But in the guidelines that we already have here, it does talk about having some paperwork signed that the parent would take on the responsibility if there's any liability issue. It also talks about in the guidelines from the Department of Education having paperwork for the parent taking responsibility. It's the student's or the handler, would be the student or the parent, the responsibility for the care of the animal, taking care of the animal's needs during the day, all that. So, but we have in our guidelines, it already has a procedure set forward to have this animal oriented to the school ahead of time and have the staff members oriented to that ahead of time. But my thought process was we need to have it a little more delineated on what we have to do for the other students, like whether sending a letter home to make sure they don't have a fear of animals, because certainly a kid who's severely afraid of an animal and the dog sitting right next to them is not going to pay attention in class, as well as looking to see if anybody has any severe allergies to animals.
And a service animal would only be permitted, it says here, if they have an IEP or 504, is that correct? So I
Yes.
can't just be a student that says, I'm having emotional challenges right now and I need my service animal.
Yeah, that service animal has to have a defined task that they perform for the student. And that would be a student with a disability. So a student with a disability, once we need to make an accommodation, they need an IEP or a 504, depending on the level of accommodation, from what I understand. And so that would have to be written into that in order for us to make that accommodation to bring the service animal in. Right? And then the other issue was when the schools had called because the parent wanted to bring their service animal in. And we really had not addressed that, to my knowledge, in the past either. And so we were talking, Mr. Dixon and myself, about putting that into the guidelines if we have a staff member or community member that wants to bring their animal in, because again, we have to look at those students that are going to be exposed to that animal. Do they have severe allergies, or they have I don't want to call it irrational, but severe fears of animals, that kind of stuff.
You said the person will take responsibility for the service animal, but that's just saying, I'll take responsibility. Is there insurance that's required, or?
Monetary insurance, like,
Yeah.
I do not know that. I'll look into that, but I know in our guidelines already, it says it's the principal can make the school administration can make that determination that the student is either caring for the dog or the dog is being disruptive, et cetera, that we can then request that they remove the animal. It's written in those guidelines.
And I'm thinking if and this probably wouldn't happen, but if an animal hurt one of the other students, scratched him accidentally or bit him or something, would there be insurance that the parent of the child that has a service animal would carry? So that would take care of the person scratched or bitten or
Yeah,
whatever.
that I don't know, that I would have to look into, but what it does say is that the parent would have to sign something saying they take responsibility for whatever that dog.
But people say that all the time,
I
they
know.
take, you know, I take responsibility, and no one does, you know.
They do have dog insurance.
Really?
You go online and get dog insurance.
I thought the
Well, that's for a
ADA,
fact.
I thought the ADA did not allow us to, not give access to a citizen with a service animal. Just, I thought the ADA required us to allow them to have access like any other
Might be the
citizen.
definition of a service
I
animal
believe
there
they
too.
do require that, but we have to come up with how we accommodate that considering our population, we have to, you know, of students. So it's not like we would not allow them, but again, it's up to the business or the entity to say whether that animal is causing an interference or not. And then they could ask them to leave if the dog was, say, unruly or going to the bathroom in the wrong places, you know. that-
We've had to address that before with certain service animals because they weren't clean, they were smelly, and those types of things. So we've had to ask people to remove those. I'm gonna pull this and we're gonna bring this back to the board at the next board meeting because the guidelines that you are referring to needs to be part of our policy. So, because and the board needs to agree to those guidelines since, it's part of the policy. So this will come back to you at the next workshop.
Okay.
Thanks.
So it's sort of like pulled now.
Yeah, I mean, you're just reviewing it, but it'll come back. Pam's right, there got some guidelines we need to
Okay.
So we'll move on to number 3, which is a new policy, 4.60 District and Statewide Assessment Program. This was discussed by a Policy and Forms Committee in January, and you know, this is required. It's basically a required policy.
I was meeting yesterday at Hernando Elementary where they went over some of the changes that have taken place in testing and everything. So what is down here takes into consideration changes that were made.
I can verify that if you want me to. I can go back and make sure everything is up to date. But like you know, this was reviewed in January, so it was the most recent thing that was sent to us. But I'll make a note to make sure everything's up to date. Okay. Next one is, let's see.
Health services plan.
Yes, this is 5.51 Health Services Plan. This is a revision. It was also discussed in January. This adds Section 2 that basically states that the plan shall include but not be limited to provisions for all aspects required by law. So that basically just encompasses everything in statute. And it adds the citations, school health services program, involuntary examination, office of private schools and home ed programs, athletics and public K-12 schools, administration of medication and provision of medical services by district school board personnel, those statutes.
Where are you reading?
Those are just the citations. Those are the titles for those.
Okay.
Just make sure you know what those are. They're being added there. Okay. And the last one is a request to revise policy 6.115, teacher aides and paraprofessionals. This was discussed in January as well. This adds section 5 on page 2 of 3, as well as a citation. The language states that an education paraprofessional may administer or proctor statewide standardized assessments or assessments associated with Florida-approved courses in accordance with the Florida statutes and State Board of Education rules. Paraprofessionals must complete required training prior to performing these tasks. And then that citation is test administration and security, public records examination.
Take me back to 1 of 3, and I wasn't sure when I was reading, I know there have been no changes, but on number 1E, that it has 1, 2, 3 under that, it says where applicable, meet the requirements requirements of No Child Left Behind mandates, and then it says hold an associate's or higher degree. What is it applying to, those three things? It's paraprofessionals, the teacher aide? Is this, in number one,
It's a teacher aide or paraprofessional.
number 1A says have a high school diploma or hold high school equivalency diploma. And then 1E1 says hold an associate's or higher degree.
Well, it says where applicable,
Okay,
so
that-
it may not be applicable in every case. But it says where applicable, meet the requirements of No Child Left Behind mandates. So if it has to meet those mandates, then it would meet one of those three criteria.
Okay, so No Child Left Behind says those three are
Right.
required. Okay. That's it, and we return to the one that Mr. Kennedy wanted to.
I'm good.
You're good?
Yep, thank you.
Okay.
So we're gonna bring that one back anyway, right? Was that the
Now you're bringing back
number
the
two?
service animals,
Service animals, okay.
and the rest are ready to move forward.
Y'all have any other statements before we close this session and go into the transportation with the closed session? Okay, we'll,
Yeah, you can say,
we'll adjourn the policy review portion.
I think it's supposed to be, Ms. Linda's going to make a note that you're going to open up a security,
Okay.
safety and security meeting pursuant to Florida Statute 281.301 and 286.0113, which means that anything regarding a security plan can be exempt from public, it's exempt from public record, it's exempt from the notice requirements of 286.0111 and everything else.
Yeah, well, I have to repeat all of that. So we're in executive session and.
Thank y'all.
Yes,
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Don't forget, you're going to turn that off now.
Doing it right now.
Thank you, sir.
Hey Susie, that nice policy